Scott here on Flip That Script. And here today, I'm going to be talking about my overall experience of going no contact. I've definitely shared that I actually did it, of course, and I've shared a great deal about what I experienced that made me feel that it was necessary. And I also did share that there was a couple caveats when it came to going, establishing, and then remaining fully no contact. That was when, after the year mark, I unblocked my phone, and at about 8.5 or 9 months, I had sent my father a letter greatly detailing why I'd gone no contact to begin with, and that after a year he could contact me. That I wasn't going to initiate contact, but he could feel free to call me as long as he was respectful and decent. And he only reached out 2 times over about an 8.5 or 9 month period. The first time took 4.5 months. Turned out to very much just be related to the fact that he became aware of my autobiography due to my toxic brother snooping my Facebook page and seeing the public posts that I made about the fact that I was writing it and then about when I was done. I kind of kept that public to confirm my suspicion that he was snooping. And I kind of did that to help confirm further to myself that he's a narcissist and that he wouldn't be able to resist seeing what was going on with me. As I mentioned in another video or two, both calls were cut short and were very abusive. He really ramped up the insulting and the put downs and the criticisms on those calls. And if anything, that very much helped to confirm to me his narcissism because of how offended he was by the no contact, how unwilling he was to be accountable for my very legitimate grievances, in which I basically stated that I wanted a different kind of mutually respectful, reciprocal, and decent relationship, or not at all. So, even though it did subject me to a small amount of abuse again on 2 occasions, I cut both conversations short. And at least I know that I had expressed my grievances and that I gave him a chance. And sadly, it really just helped confirm to me that he is very toxic and indeed a textbook narcissist. Besides my brother snooping, he also found his way onto a couple of Facebook pages that I have, actually 3. One that was a Facebook page I'd created some years back to promote my books, and then a memorial page for my first late wife, and then a memorial page also for our mother. And my brother wrote a dozen or more total very insulting comments on those pages, including basically making a sacrilege of the memorial pages. I wanted to more talk about my overall experience including from the very beginning of going no contact and without referring back to those caveats, to when there was some very minimal contact by phone and social media. And of course, as I mentioned, then my father was invited to do remote counseling with me because his 2 phone calls were abusive, so I was restricting the boundaries even more. And then he failed that, and that's when I went back to no contact. When I first went no contact, it was after 3-4 weeks of having had the insight into their narcissism, or let's say the epiphany, and then doing a lot of reading and watching of YouTube videos and confirming that that's really what it was. So I acted pretty quickly because it was like within a month that I was no contact between the time that I first realized what had been at play for all these decades and when I actually did it. As I mentioned in some other videos, I'd already really been low contact with both of them before I even knew what that was. I went no contact with my father on March 27th of 2020, and then my brother about 2.5 weeks later on April 17th of 2020. When I first went no contact, at first there was really a sense of relief and liberation. Like I just felt like celebrating that I'd learned and figured out what to do, even though it was an extreme measure, to be free of their abuse. I had read and learned a lot about that you're doing it for you and not to quote unquote show them. And I really understood that, and I was ready to be free of the abuse and felt certain, based on everything that I've read and learned and then later experienced, related to that caveat that I said I wouldn't mention, that it really was never going to end unless I went no contact. After a little time, because it's a grieving process, it's very interesting. It's kind of like people feel relief when a loved one dies at first, before they start feeling the other emotions, particularly if it's been a long, or I should say in the case of a long illness. And that's really what it had been. My relationships with them had been sick, dysfunctional, abusive. And I was free of that experience. So yes, at first I felt great relief and also great liberation and empowerment. After probably a matter of a few weeks or so, after that really started to wear off, I started to feel a lot of anger, especially towards my father, or let's at least say towards his behavior. This whole process for me has been much more intense in regards to my father compared to my brother. I just think that has, for me anyway, to do a lot more to do with it just seems like it's easier to imagine a relationship with a sibling that's troubled and having a difficult sibling in general, even though he's my only one and have nothing to compare it to. I think that's just easier to accept. I feel like I've really written him off in a certain sense, even though we're low contact. My expectations of him were lowered, even like way back when I was like college age. I don't like so even now, almost 3 years later, I can honestly say that I haven't shed much of a tear or had much of any experience emotionally with severing ties with him. Some, but very little. I almost liken it to like I lost a great grandmother who was 103 back in '97, and even that was sad, and I missed her and I grieved some. It was like within a few weeks of some crying here and there, I was better. She lived a nice, long, full life. And I guess it's almost like on a certain level, I had already grieved that my brother was just the way that he was, even though I never fully understood the problem back then. But with my father, I think you just expect more from a parent. You just do. Um, there was a lot of anger, and I let myself feel the anger. I really felt it. I really felt the injustice of it. I felt just mad. Why? How could you treat your son this way, etc., etc.? It's good to get those feelings out. It's normal and natural, even when you understand that it's a personality disorder that makes them behave the way that they do. Because it still has that impact on you. And abuse is just wrong, even when you understand where it's coming from and their sickness, their disorder. And then I went through sadness and just kind of went through a grieving process, the same as when someone dies, because I was essentially grieving that even though my father's still here, that he was out of my life, almost like as if he had passed away. I orphaned myself. Something I read before in a book that I'm going to recommend in another video, along with some other ones, that it's like you break your own heart really bad one time so that they can't break it over and over. And that's what I did. It took a good 6, 7, almost 8 months, I'd say. Yeah, by about 6 months or so, I was starting to feel like the grieving process was starting to kind of resolve. And then around that time, and even a little bit further back, but at least 4 or 5 months in, and then more so after it got to 6 months or so, I made the conscious choice to forgive. A lot of that came from what I spoke about in the previous video, about understanding that his disorder and the pain and trauma that that's an overcompensation for is what makes him behave the way that he does. It kind of helped me to start to reframe everything I had experienced in a way that I was kind of almost retroactively able to take what had happened less personally. I guess the best way I can put that is I took it less personally because although I was the scapegoat and the target, if I hadn't been born, and if a different child had been conceived, the same time that I was conceived, to put it quite literally, if a different sperm had made it to my mom's egg and a different child was born, that child would or could also have been targeted. That's the easiest way for me to explain that I didn't take it personally because I was the son that was scapegoated, and if it wasn't me and if a different child had been born, it would have been them. If that makes sense. After that time, when it started to kind of resolve my grief experience of cutting ties, it took another month or two for me to decide that I was going to send a grievance letter. And that's when I had the thoughts about giving him another chance, but still being very strict about it being the 1-year mark, that this would give him a few months to think about what was in the letter. And that I was definitely not going to back down on the boundaries that I was establishing about that if he wasn't decent and respectful, I was going to hang up, and that if it happened repeatedly, that I could end up going no contact again for good. What I can tell you, and now this is interesting that this can happen, but I've heard of it happen with people grieving losses in general. In retrospect, I realized that once I reached that point, that actually for another year or so, the late summer of 2022, this would be after it took him 9 months to do the calls and to have the failed remote counseling session. I kind of felt like I was powering through, but I only realized this in retrospect because when we got to late summer of what would have been a little over the 2-year mark, late summer of 2022, I started to realize that I still had unresolved grief from going no contact. And at that point, I'd been having just quarterly sessions and then actually semi-annual sessions with the counselor that I'd first connected with when my late first wife died suddenly back in 2017. When I first went no contact, we did quarterly sessions in 2020 and 2021 and 2022. We did semi-annual sessions. So in late summer, I decided to kind of tune back into myself and really reflect and think, am I really done grieving? And I realized that I wasn't. I got in touch with and found a local therapist who actually is very knowledgeable about these issues, and started doing sessions every 2 weeks with her. That's been going on for 4 months now or so, starting in October of 2022. And she says that about another 4 or 5 sessions, somewhere thereabouts, we should be done. So I started grieving again. Not as intensely as I did in those first months after first going no contact, but there was some real sadness and despair and disappointment still inside of me that I hadn't really fully dealt with. So I started allowing myself to grieve again, and wasn't as intense, like I said, as at the beginning, but for a good 5-10 minutes a day, I'd have like a really good cry. Starting back like around late August of 2022. At that point, it had been almost 2.5 years. And that took a good probably 4 or 5 months before those good maybe 5-10 minute cries started turning more into 2-3 minute cries, and then just really in the last month or so that it would take 4 or 5 days before I'd have one of those little cries. And I'm glad that I recognized that and kind of tuned into that and realized that I still had to grieve more. And I'm glad that I found a specialist that really understands. She has good professional experience and education regarding this kind of as a specialty, these issues, and unfortunately has firsthand experience of having a toxic father with whom, as she tells me, is kind of more like mid-scale on the spectrum. I consider my father and brother both to be very high on the spectrum, and she's low contact with him. So, in case this is helpful for you to know it, realize that it could be possible that you might feel like your grief is resolved or largely resolved, and then discover later that it isn't. I realize now that part of the reason that that might have happened that way for me was because at the time that I'd gone no contact and started grieving again, I'd say grieving again, but grieving after having grieved my first late wife. I'd kind of come into a new chapter in my life about 2 years out from her passing, and was in a relationship with who is now my new wife. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I was about 6 months into kind of having a new life. I'd gotten out of my old house. I had restructured my business that I shared with my first wife, etc. A lot of changes. So I think that maybe I just even needed a break, because then after a lot of grieving for a couple of years, here it was like about 6 months later, and then I'm grieving something intense like having to cut ties with my father. Um, so if this happens to you, it could be for similar reasons, and you realize that because there was too much going on in your life, or other stresses, or something not too far off from the heels of, if you end up severing ties, and then it could make for the process to come in different phases like that, where it's even spaced out for a year or more without grieving, and then you go back to grieving. The important thing is that you allow it to unfold, and if it stops unfolding at some point, like it did for me, that you at least at some point recognize it, and then maybe recognize why that happened, and then go back to dealing with it again. I can tell you that through this whole process too, that I spent a lot of time watching, reading books about, watching YouTube videos about, and reading blogs and articles and so forth about toxic families, about going no contact, about narcissism, emotional abuse, etc. And probably at some points I did too much of that, but then I cut back. And at this point now, with my grief, I think finally resolving, still allowing it to flow, but it not seeming to pop up except maybe every 4 or 5 days, and having a little cry that's maybe not even a minute. Cutting down on reading about it and watching YouTube videos about it, I think, is part of my process with it too, and probably the same for a lot of people. I'm going to talk about that in another video. So my experience, like a lot of other people's, was about experiencing grief, but having the insight and understanding that sometimes it's what you need to do. And I can tell you that I don't regret that I did it. I just regret that I had to. But that's something that, the fact that I had to, is something that was out of my hands. And I've grown in forgiveness and acceptance. And have started to, over time, just integrate it into the story of my life and my life experience. Speaking of which, the other thing that I wanted to share, apart from the emotions, is since I've gone no contact, a lot of really good things have happened in my life. A lot of very positive things. One is that I'm remarried. Kathy and I had been engaged, as I went into in other videos about when I first broke contact. We're engaged on Valentine's Day in 2020. I moved in with her in the fall of 2021, and we were married in June of 2022. We had a very nice honeymoon in Cancun for a week, and in fact, we have booked a vacation to go back there for 2 weeks this summer in 2023. one of the really great things that happened shortly after I broke contact in the spring of 2020 is that on April 15th of 2020, I was sitting in my car parked, listening to a little bit of music and getting ready to go into a store. I got a ding on my phone. Scott, it's your Uncle Bob. I just found you on Facebook. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I'd like to talk. Give me a call. And he sent his phone number. That is my late mother's brother. He's the one whose wife my father had slept with right after my mom passed away, as I mentioned in some other videos. We never had a falling out, and I don't even think estranged is quite the right word, but we had drifted apart and just lost contact with one another maybe a year or so after me and my first wife were married. So I think it's very interesting, the timing there. But after it taking then about another almost 20 years for me to go no contact with my father and brother, notice how little that seems to even mean to me, that sometimes I have to work him into these since I did go no contact with him. But it's such a insignificant experience to me overall compared to breaking ties with my father. I don't even know if saying breaking ties is quite even the right word, because that relationship still always lives within you. But in any case, I messaged him back just about right away. And then when I got over to Kathy's house, I told her what had happened, and I gave him a call. I called him on through Messenger with the camera. And we've become very, very close. I've been speaking to him just about every Friday, practically without fail, for almost 3 years now. My mother has another brother, his younger brother. He's come back into the picture also. And the thing that was very confirming and validating for me is that he shared with me that the reason it took him about a year to come around and be sure that he wanted to see me and reconnect is he wanted to make sure I hadn't turned out like them. So, apart from the whole thing with my father sleeping with my older Uncle Bob's wife at a time that their relationship was a little bit shaky, it's just a small part of that. There were other reasons that neither one of them really want to have anything to do with my father or with my brother. So, as sad as that is, it's very validating for me and very much confirms that they're not well. I've seen and gotten together with my Uncle Bob in person, must be 6, 7, 8 times now. The last time, him and my other uncle, his younger brother, my Uncle Ron, and his wife came to see me and Kathy. Had dinner together, played piano for them, sang some, just talked and socialized. So my Uncle Ronnie has been with me in person now like 3 or 4 times, and my Uncle Bob 7 or 8 times. I still talk to my Uncle Bob once a week. I feel close to my Uncle Ron also, but we don't have regular conversations like that. But it's great to see him and stay in touch. They came to our wedding. Since the time of breaking no contact, I also wrote or finished a book that I was halfway through, the third volume of a 5-book, 5-volume series that I've now created. So I was halfway through that third book at the time that I broke contact. I finished that book, wrote 2 more after it. If you're interested, all of my books are on Amazon. Just put in Scott Patrick McGowan, you'll see them pop up. So that 5-volume series has been completed. I then wrote 2 children's books. One of them was featured on the news. There's a short news clip, the local news that I was on, that talked about the book and what the children's book is about. And I appeared for maybe 10 seconds on that news clip. And then, as you've heard about, I also wrote my autobiography. And I also you heard about the one autobiographical business article that I wrote and had published that my father poo-pooed. I had a second contributor article published in a different elite online publication. And I have also come a long way with my business, with this transition of phasing out the employment arm, the music school that my first wife and I had founded. And I've built my own private teaching roster back up to 50 mostly remote students. Actually, as of today, it's 51. I just met with a family today that I'm going to be teaching in person starting next Saturday. And I have decided, so I've gotten a lot of success with converting to the remote platform as well, obviously. And just a couple of weeks ago, I decided that I'm going to actually max my schedule out at closer to 60 or a little over 60 students by leveraging the difference in time zones and marketing my remote lessons to California. I have a sign that's going to be going up, a legal street sign. It's going up on March 15th. And I have a small display ad that's going to be in another area of California. And it's going to be in this online publication that appears once a week. And I'm starting off with that. And I'm not pie in the sky about it. I'm very steadfast with my business. I expect that completing this next phase of my business and getting in 8 to 10 students from California, probably going to take 6 months or so, and then I'll feel out what it takes to maintain my schedule like this. I've been saving money, and I've started a retirement account. It's earning good interest, like over 4% interest. And things look good for me to ultimately end up retiring in about 10 years or so. I'm going to do it either when I'm 65 or maybe when I'm 70. We're going to have a decent amount of money to supplement my Social Security, which I've checked on those numbers too, and I'm right on target with what the current expenses are and what I'm saving now, even before adding to my business, to be able to have a comfortable retirement. I have gone to Daytona with Kathy twice since the no contact. That was before our wedding and honeymoon. Our wedding was absolutely awesome. We had about 180 people there all together, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful day. Great venue in a hall where we had both the ceremony and the reception. It was like a great big party. Um, had a minister who Kathy liked very much, who had been friends with my first wife. So that felt nice. And I still stay in regular touch with my late wife's family. That's my stepdaughter, who actually is in a very serious relationship now the last few years with a good friend of mine. My stepson and his wife. My grandson, who's actually transitioned from being a girl, my grandson, who I also love very much. And I stay in touch with my first wife's brother. All of these folks were at the wedding. Get along very well with all of Kathy's family. She has 4 brothers and 2 sisters. Get along great with her dad's girlfriend. And I'm working with a publicist to probably get another article published. It's going to end up being about my 30 years of doing my own thing, my whole music instruction business and all the different phases it's been through. And it's quite possible that next spring they might end up doing a group vacation with some friends. We've been invited to be part of a group vacation to Costa Rica. So, it's been quite a journey, and I just have so much to be grateful for. And it's, again, it's sad that I had to go no contact, but I guess one way you can look at it is that taking care of yourself and not allowing negative experiences to come into your life, if those negative experiences come attached to some kind of obligation to continue to have a relationship or contact with family members, in the long run, you're better off. And after a while, I can say it's also good to just let the truth speak for itself. You know what happened, you know why you did what you did, and you're just taking care of yourself. Again, I don't regret that I did it. I just regret that I had to do it. And I have so much to be happy about, a lot of joy in my life, a lot of fulfillment, and a lot to be grateful for.